On a cold January morning in 2001, in the heart of Birmingham, England, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell left her flat on Barker Street to walk to work at the city center bookshop where she'd been employed for 3 years. She was 23 years old, described by everyone who knew her as careful, punctual, and devoted to her younger sister. She never arrived at work that day. Her body was discovered 72 hours later in a shallow grave in Sutton Park, 7 miles north of the city. She had been strangled. For nearly 24 years, her killer walked free, hidden behind a wall of silence, protected by time and the limitations of early forensic technology. Then, in the autumn of 2024, 2 arrests shattered the quiet resignation that had settled over this case like dust on a closed file. The question that haunted investigators for more than 2 decades finally had an answer. But how had the truth remained buried for so long, and what finally brought it into the light? Birmingham in 2001 was a city in transition. The Bullring Shopping Center was being demolished and rebuilt. The International Convention Center had brought new energy to the waterfront. But away from the gleaming developments in neighborhoods like Sparkbrook and Balsall Heath, life moved to older rhythms. Terraced houses lined narrow streets. Corner shops stayed open late. People knew their neighbors, or thought they did. Sarah Mitchell lived in a converted flat on the 3rd floor of a Victorian building on Barker Street, in the Digbeth area, an industrial neighborhood that had seen better days but was beginning to show signs of regeneration. The building housed 6 flats total. Downstairs lived an elderly couple who had been there since the 70s. Next door to Sarah was a young man who worked night shifts at a warehouse and was rarely seen during daylight hours. The flat felt safe enough. The front door locked. The windows faced the street. Sarah had lived there for 18 months, ever since she'd saved enough from her bookshop wages to move out of her mother's house in King's Heath. Sarah's routine was predictable in the way that young working people's routines often are. She rose at 7 each morning. She made instant coffee in a chipped mug her sister had given her for Christmas. She dressed in layers because the flat was always cold and the bookshop wasn't much warmer. She left the flat at 8:15 to catch the number 47 bus from the stop on High Street, Digbeth. The journey took 20 minutes in light traffic. She was due at work by 9. She was never late. Her younger sister, Emma, was 17 at the time and still lived at home with their mother in a semi-detached house south of the city center. The 2 sisters spoke on the phone almost every evening. They had been close since childhood, especially after their father had left when Emma was only 9. Sarah was protective, always checking in, always making sure Emma had money for the cinema or new trainers when she needed them. Their mother, Linda Mitchell, worked as a teaching assistant at a primary school. Money was tight, but the family was stable, ordinary, unremarkable in every way that mattered. January 17, 2001, was a Wednesday. The sky was overcast, threatening rain but not yet delivering it. The temperature hovered around 4 degrees Celsius. A typical winter morning in the Midlands, the kind that makes people walk faster and pull their collars higher. Sarah left her flat at 8:13 that morning, 2 minutes earlier than usual. A neighbor, Mrs. Rashid from the flat below, heard the door close. She remembered because she was feeding her cat at the kitchen window and glanced up at the sound. She saw Sarah's back as she descended the exterior stairs to the street level. Sarah wore a dark blue coat and carried a canvas bag over her shoulder. Mrs. Rashid returned to her cat. She thought nothing more of it. Sarah never boarded the number 47 bus that morning. The driver, a man named Colin Peters who had been driving that route for 6 years, knew Sarah by sight. She was a regular. He noticed when regular passengers didn't appear, the way you notice an empty seat at a familiar dinner table. He mentioned it to his supervisor during his break, but only in passing. People missed buses all the time. They overslept. They called in sick. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. At the bookshop, Sarah's absence was noted immediately. The manager, a woman named Helen Cross, tried calling Sarah's flat at 9:15. No answer. She tried again at 10:30. Still nothing. By lunchtime, Helen was concerned enough to call Sarah's mother. Linda Mitchell felt the first cold finger of fear touch her spine when Helen's voice came through the phone line, apologetic but worried. Sarah had never missed work without calling. Never. Linda tried Sarah's flat every 15 minutes for the next hour. Each ring went unanswered. She called Emma at school, pulling her out of a mathematics lesson. Emma hadn't spoken to Sarah since the previous evening, a brief call around 8 where they'd talked about nothing important, made plans to go shopping on Saturday. Everything had been normal. Everything had been fine. By 3 that afternoon, Linda Mitchell had driven to Barker Street and was standing outside Sarah's flat, knocking on the door with increasing desperation. The neighbor, the young man who worked nights, opened his door and told her he hadn't seen Sarah leave that morning, but he'd been asleep until noon. Mrs. Rashid came up the stairs and confirmed she'd seen Sarah leave at the usual time, maybe a bit earlier. She'd been alone. She'd seemed fine. Linda called the police at 4:37 that afternoon. The officer who took the call was professional but measured in his response. Sarah was a grown woman. She'd been missing for less than 8 hours. Adults had the right to disappear if they wanted to. Perhaps there'd been a row with a boyfriend. Perhaps she'd needed some space. Linda insisted Sarah had no boyfriend. Sarah would never just vanish. The officer took down the details and said someone would follow up. He sounded like he'd had this conversation 100 times before. By nightfall, when Sarah still hadn't returned, the police response shifted. Missing persons who vanish from their normal routines without explanation are rare enough to warrant immediate attention, especially young women walking alone in the morning. A detective named James Barrow was assigned to the case. He was 42 years old, a veteran of Birmingham CID with a reputation for thoroughness. He arrived at Linda Mitchell's house in Kings Heath at 9 that evening. Emma sat beside her mother on the sofa, her face pale, her hands twisted together in her lap. Detective Barrow asked the questions he always asked. Had Sarah seemed troubled lately? Any new people in her life? Any problems at work? Money troubles? The answers were all the same. No, no, no. Sarah was steady. Sarah was careful. Sarah called her sister every night. The search began in earnest the following morning. Officers retraced Sarah's route from Barker Street to the bus stop on High Street, Digbeth. They interviewed the bus driver, the neighbors, the staff at the bookshop. They checked CCTV cameras along the route, but in 2001, coverage was patchy at best. The cameras that did exist showed nothing useful. A grainy image of a woman in a dark coat walking east on High Street at approximately 8:17 could have been Sarah. Could have been anyone. Clear's throat. By Friday evening, 48 hours after Sarah had vanished, the investigation had expanded to include volunteer search parties. Local residents walked through Digbeth calling Sarah's name. They checked bins, alleyways, derelict buildings. The story had made the evening news. Sarah's photograph appeared on screen, a studio portrait from the previous year where she smiled gently at the camera, her dark hair pulled back, her expression open and trusting. The newsreader used words like concern and appeal for information. Linda and Emma Mitchell sat together watching the broadcast, holding hands, saying nothing. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came on Saturday morning. A dog walker in Sutton Park, a large public park on the northern edge of Birmingham, noticed his border collie behaving strangely near a wooded area called Longmoor Pool. The dog had found something. The walker approached and saw freshly turned earth, clumsily disguised with fallen branches and leaf litter. He called the police immediately. The body was Sarah Mitchell's. She had been strangled with such force that the hyoid bone in her throat was fractured. The pathologist estimated she had been dead for approximately 60 to 70 hours, which meant she had been killed within hours of disappearing, possibly on the same morning. There were defensive wounds on her hands. She had fought. Her clothing was partially disturbed, but there was no evidence of sexual assault. Her canvas bag was missing. Her mobile phone was missing. Whoever had done this had taken her from the street in broad daylight, killed her quickly, and dumped her body in a location 7 miles from where she was last seen. Detective Barrow stood at the edge of the shallow grave and felt the familiar weight of a murder investigation settle onto his shoulders. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a hunt. The investigation into Sarah Mitchell's murder consumed the Birmingham Major Crimes Unit for months. Detective Barrow assembled a team of 8 officers. They worked 16-hour days. They built a timeline. They mapped every minute of Sarah's last known morning. They interviewed 237 people. They collected statements, receipts, CCTV footage, phone records. They looked at every man Sarah had ever known, however briefly. The forensic evidence was maddeningly sparse. The shallow grave in Sutton Park had been exposed to rain for 3 days before the body was discovered. Any trace evidence that might have clung to Sarah's clothing or skin had been compromised or washed away. There were no fingerprints, no usable DNA, no fibers that couldn't be explained by Sarah's own environment. The pathologist confirmed strangulation as cause of death but could offer little else. The weapon was human hands. The killer had left almost nothing behind. Those who knew Sarah spoke of her with a kind of aching reverence. Her colleagues at the bookshop described her as gentle, thoughtful, someone who remembered customers' names and recommendations. Her friends from school, most of whom had drifted into different orbits as adulthood took hold, remembered her as loyal and funny in a quiet way. Her family painted a picture of a young woman who had been excited about her independence, proud of her little flat, planning to save money for a car, maybe travel someday. There was no darkness in her life that anyone could identify. No stalker, no obsessed ex-boyfriend, no debts to dangerous people. She was, by every account, someone who should not have been murdered. The investigation focused initially on opportunity. Someone had taken Sarah between her flat and the bus stop, a distance of 300 meters. That meant the killer either knew her routine, had been following her, or had encountered her by terrible chance. Detective Barrow believed the first option was most likely. Random abductions in daylight from busy streets were rare. This felt planned, even if the planning had been crude. The police looked hard at Sarah's neighbors. The young man who worked nights had an alibi. He'd been clocked in at his warehouse job until 7 that morning and had mobile phone records placing him in Erdington, miles away, when Sarah disappeared. Mrs. Rashid had been home with her husband. The elderly couple downstairs rarely left their flat. None of them had criminal records. None of them raised flags. They looked at Sarah's coworkers. The bookshop employed 6 people total. All of them had been at work on Wednesday morning, accounted for and witnessed by customers and each other. Helen Cross, the manager, had worked at the shop for 12 years and was respected throughout the community. There was nothing there. They looked at men Sarah had dated, a short list that included a former classmate she'd seen briefly 2 years earlier, and a man she'd met at a pub quiz who she'd gone out with 3 times before deciding he wasn't right for her. Both men were interviewed. Both had solid alibis. Both seemed genuinely shocked by her death. As winter turned to spring, the leads dried up. The volunteer search parties disbanded. The news moved on to other tragedies. The incident room at Birmingham CID slowly emptied as officers were reassigned to newer cases. Detective Barrow kept a photograph of Sarah Mitchell on his desk, but even he had to admit the investigation had stalled. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without a clear suspect, they had nowhere left to look. Clears throat. The case went cold in the summer of 2001. Not officially closed, but dormant, waiting for new information that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion curl around your thoughts like smoke, you understand the particular torture of uncertainty. Linda and Emma Mitchell tried to rebuild their lives in the shadow of Sarah's murder. They moved house 6 months after her death, unable to bear the sight of the empty third bedroom, the space where Sarah should have been when she visited. They relocated to a smaller flat in Solihull, southeast of the city, where no one knew their story unless they chose to tell it. Emma returned to school but struggled to concentrate. She sat through lessons with her mind elsewhere, replaying the last conversation she'd had with her sister, searching for meaning in mundane words. She developed insomnia. She would wake at 3 in the morning and stare at the ceiling, listening to her mother cry in the next room. The grief counselor the NHS provided was kind but ineffective. How do you counsel someone through a grief that has no resolution, no answers, no end? Linda Mitchell stopped working at the primary school. She couldn't bear the noise of children, their thoughtless joy, their whole lives ahead of them. She took a job doing data entry from home, a position that allowed her to remain isolated, to avoid questions, to exist in a kind of suspended animation. She spoke about Sarah constantly in the first year, then hardly at all in the years that followed. The silence was not healing. It was just easier than the alternative. The police kept the case on file. Every few years, when new forensic technology emerged, they would pull the evidence and test it again. Mitochondrial DNA analysis in 2003 yielded nothing useful. Improved fiber analysis in 2006 confirmed what they already knew. Sarah had been in contact with common materials that existed in thousands of homes. There were no breakthroughs. In 2008, a man serving time for an unrelated assault mentioned Sarah Mitchell's name to his cellmate, claiming he knew who had killed her. The cellmate reported it. Detectives interviewed the man. He recanted within hours, admitting he'd made it up for attention, hopping for a transfer or early parole. It was a dead end, but it reopened wounds for the Mitchell family that had barely begun to scar over. Emma Mitchell graduated from university in 2009 with a degree in psychology. Those who knew her said she carried a quiet intensity, a watchfulness, as though she were always waiting for something. She rarely spoke about her sister in public, but friends noticed she wore a silver necklace that had belonged to Sarah, a simple chain with a small starfish pendant. She never took it off. By 2015, 14 years had passed since Sarah's murder. Detective James Barrow had retired. The case file sat in storage, occasionally reviewed but no longer actively investigated. The general assumption, though never stated officially, was that whoever had killed Sarah Mitchell had either died, been imprisoned for another crime, or left the country. The chances of solving the case grew more remote with each passing year. But in March 2015, something shifted. A woman named Catherine Price walked into a police station in Nottingham, 60 miles northeast of Birmingham, and told an officer she had information about an old murder. She was 41 years old, a social worker, a mother of 2. She seemed nervous but determined. The duty officer took down her details and passed them along. Catherine Price had lived in Birmingham in 2001. She had worked as a receptionist at a dental surgery in the city center. She had known a man named Michael Donnelly, a dental technician at the same practice. They had been friends, casual acquaintances who sometimes shared lunch breaks. On the morning of January 17, 2001, Catherine had seen Michael arrive at work at 9:45, flustered and sweating despite the cold weather. He had scratches on his neck. When she asked if he was all right, he'd told her he'd been in a minor car accident, nothing serious. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. Then, weeks later, When Sarah Mitchell's photograph appeared on the news, Catherine had felt a strange unease. She couldn't place why. It was only years afterward, in therapy for unrelated issues, that the memory had surfaced with new clarity. Michael Donnelly had lived on Barker Street in 2001, same building as Sarah Mitchell. Catherine had been to his flat once for a work gathering. She remembered the address because it had seemed like such a rough area for someone with a decent job. The scratches on his neck, the flustered arrival, the same building. Catherine Price had spent 14 years trying to convince herself she was imagining connections that didn't exist, but the doubt had never left her. In 2015, she finally decided she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. She went to the police. The information reached Birmingham CID within 24 hours. A detective named Sarah Chen, who had joined the force years after the Mitchell murder but had reviewed the cold case file during her training, recognized the significance immediately. Michael Donnelly had been interviewed in 2001 as a neighbor, but only briefly. He'd claimed he was at work when Sarah disappeared. That alibi had never been fully verified because he hadn't been considered a serious suspect at the time. No one had noticed scratches on his neck because no one had been looking for them. Detective Chen pulled the old case file. Michael Donnelly had been 29 years old in 2001, unmarried, no criminal record. He'd worked at the dental surgery for 3 years. He told police he'd left for work at 8:30 on the morning Sarah disappeared and hadn't seen her. According to the file, no one had checked his work attendance records. In the chaos of a murder investigation with hundreds of leads, that single thread had been missed. Chen began digging. Michael Donnelly had left Birmingham in 2002, moving to Manchester. He'd worked at several dental labs over the years. He'd married in 2006. He had 2 children. He lived in a semi-detached house in Stockport and appeared to be, by all outward measures, a respectable middle-aged man with a stable life. But Chen kept digging. She found something in Donnelly's employment record at the dental surgery that made her pulse quicken. On January 17, 2001, Michael Donnelly had called in sick at 8:55 that morning. He had not arrived at work at 9:45 flustered and sweating, as Catherine Price remembered. He had arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, claiming he'd felt better after resting at home. Catherine's memory had compressed the timeline, a common occurrence 14 years after the fact, but the core details remained. The scratches, the agitation, the same building as the victim. Detective Chen presented her findings to her superior officer in June 2015. The response was cautious but interested. Cold cases were difficult to resurrect. Memories faded. Evidence degraded. But there was enough here to warrant a second look. They obtained records of Donnelly's mobile phone activity from January 2001. The telecommunications data, stored in archives, showed his phone had been in the vicinity of Sutton Park at approximately 11:15 on the morning of January 17th. He had made no calls, but the phone had pinged a mast near the park. It was circumstantial. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to keep digging. Over the next 9 years, Detective Chen worked the case when she could, between other assignments, filing away pieces of information, building a profile of Michael Donnelly that revealed a man more complicated than his surface suggested. She found a domestic incident report from 2010 where Donnelly's wife had called police after an argument that had turned physical. No charges had been filed. She found a former girlfriend from Donnelly's 20s who described him as possessive and prone to sudden anger when he felt rejected or ignored. She found neighbors from his time on Barker Street who remembered him as odd, too friendly, someone who watched people a bit too closely. None of it was proof, all of it was suggestive. The breakthrough finally came in 2024, 23 years after Sarah Mitchell's murder. Advances in DNA technology had reached a point where degraded or minimal samples could be analyzed with far greater accuracy. Detective Chen, now a senior investigator, requested that Sarah's clothing be re-examined using the latest techniques. A private forensics lab in London, working with the Birmingham police, found something that had been missed in every previous analysis. On the collar of Sarah's coat, preserved in an evidence bag for more than 2 decades, were skin cells, not Sarah's, male skin cells. The DNA extracted was partial but sufficient for comparison. Detective Chen obtained a warrant for Michael Donnelly's DNA. It required showing a judge the accumulated circumstantial evidence, the location, the phone data, the scratches, the pattern of concerning behavior. The warrant was granted in August 2024. Michael Donnelly was swabbed at his home in Stockport on August 23rd. He complied without resistance, telling officers he had nothing to hide. He said he barely remembered Sarah Mitchell, though he acknowledged they'd lived in the same building once, long ago. He seemed confident. He seemed certain this would come to nothing. The DNA was a match. On October 14, 2024, Michael Donnelly was arrested and charged with the murder of Sarah Mitchell. The arrest took place at his workplace, a dental laboratory in Manchester, at 9 in the morning. Colleagues watched in stunned silence as 2 detectives led him out in handcuffs. His face, witnesses later said, showed not shock but resignation, as though he'd been waiting for this moment for 23 years. A second arrest followed 24 hours later. Catherine Price's statement had included mention of another dental technician, a man named Robert Fry, who had been particularly close to Donnelly in 2001. Detective Chen had investigated Fry years earlier but found nothing conclusive. Now, with Donnelly in custody, they pressed harder. Fry's mobile phone had also been near Sutton Park on the morning of January 17, 2001. Under interrogation, facing evidence of his presence at the disposal site, Robert Fry broke down and confessed his role. He had helped Donnelly move Sarah's body. He claimed he hadn't known she was dead when Donnelly called him in a panic that morning. He claimed he'd only realized what he'd done when it was too late. He claimed he'd been terrified of Donnelly, of what would happen if he told the truth. For 23 years, he had lived with the knowledge of what they'd done. Now, finally, he gave a statement. According to Fry's confession, Michael Donnelly had developed an obsession with Sarah Mitchell. He had watched her routine, had tried to talk to her multiple times in the building's shared stairwell, had been rebuffed politely but firmly. On the morning of January 17th, he had followed her from Barker Street. He had approached her again, had asked her to have coffee with him. She had declined. He had grabbed her. She had fought. The scratches on his neck had come from her fingernails as she tried to push him away. He had strangled her in an alley off High Street, Digbeth, in broad daylight in a moment of rage and desperation. He had panicked. He had called Fry. Together, they had driven her body to Sutton Park and buried it. Clear's throat. The news of the arrest sent shockwaves through Birmingham. The Mitchell case had been largely forgotten by the public, a cold case gathering dust. Now it was front-page news again. Journalists descended on Barker Street, interviewing elderly residents who still remembered that awful January. They found Helen Cross, the bookshop manager, now retired, who wept openly when told that Sarah's killer had finally been caught. They tried to contact Linda and Emma Mitchell, but were met with a terse statement through a family liaison officer. "We are relieved that someone will finally be held accountable." Michael Donnelly pleaded not guilty. His defense team argued the DNA evidence was contaminated, mishandled, unreliable after so many years. They argued that Fry's confession was coerced, that he was a vulnerable man who had been manipulated by aggressive interrogators. They painted Donnelly as a man whose life had been ruined by coincidence and faulty science. The trial began in April 2025. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the phone records, Catherine Price's testimony, Robert Fry's confession. They presented the pattern of behavior, the domestic violence incident, the former girlfriend's account. They showed the jury photographs of Sarah Mitchell alive and photographs of where her body had been found. They called Emma Mitchell to the stand. She testified in a clear, steady voice about the sister she had lost, about the 24 years her family had waited for this moment. Michael Donnelly's defense called expert witnesses to challenge the DNA evidence. They called character witnesses who described him as a devoted father and husband. They argued reasonable doubt. They suggested alternative suspects who had never been properly investigated. The jury deliberated for 5 days. On May 9, 2025, they returned a verdict, guilty of murder. Michael Donnelly showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He stared straight ahead, his hands folded on the table in front of him. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 28 years before he would be eligible for parole. Robert Fry, who had cooperated with the investigation and pleaded guilty to assisting an offender, received a sentence of 8 years. Linda Mitchell, now 67 years old, attended every day of the trial. She sat in the public gallery with Emma beside her, both women silent and watchful. When the guilty verdict was announced, Linda closed her eyes and took a breath that seemed to carry 24 years of weight. Emma reached for her mother's hand. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing left to say. Outside the courthouse, Detective Sarah Chen faced a wall of cameras and microphones. She was asked how it felt to finally solve a case that had haunted Birmingham for nearly a quarter century. She said, "This was never about personal achievement. This was about Sarah Mitchell, who deserved to live a full life, and about her family, who deserved answers. Today they got those answers. That's all that matters." The case of Sarah Mitchell reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. For 24 years, her killer walked free, protected by time and luck and the limitations of the evidence that existed in 2001. But forensic science evolved. Memories resurfaced. Conscience gnawed at witnesses who had remained silent. And in the end, the truth emerged, as it sometimes does, through a combination of persistence, technology, and the courage of one woman who finally spoke up. Sarah Mitchell was 23 years old when her life was stolen from her on a cold January morning. She will never be more than 23. She will never save for that car, never travel, never grow old with the sister who still wears her necklace every day. But her name is now synonymous with something other than tragedy. It is synonymous with the idea that truth, however long it takes, can still find its way into the light. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.